Well, these results look quite good, according to the circumstances, James's doctor said, reading the compiled data from the many medical tests of his digital chart. Your cell counts are all within acceptable levels, and there seems to be no lasting nerve damage from the venom. Your lung is also shaping up to make a full recovery if we allow it to rest a little longer, though there is a chance that we have to go into surgery at some point, just to remove some scar tissue. Apart from that, you should be able to start physical therapy soon, and I'm quite confident you will be back on your feet in no time. James nodded along with her explanations. She was clearly used to giving the easy version to her patients, and James almost wished that she went into a little more detail about his condition, as he was confident that he would be able to keep up, better than the average injured soldier, but he decided not to try and pry for more info. Instead, he just exhaled with a bit of exhaustion, still slightly out of breath from an earlier measuring of his current lung capacity. Can't come soon enough, he sighed, already feeling like he was starting to rust even though he had basically just woken up from what seemed to be a slightly extended absence of consciousness. What kind of idiot misses his own inauguration? He could see his doctor roll her eyes just a little as she put the tablet she was reading off down. The kind of idiot who survives an assassination attempt just before that, she responded, with a tone of encouraging amusement. Despite her pleasant tone, James couldn't help but grimace a bit. Assassination attempt? Hardly, he mused aloud, sinking back into the large pillow that was supporting his back and neck. By now the haziness had largely disappeared from his mind, and he had been able to piece everything that had happened together for the most part. I mean, they tried to kill me, yes, but really they had no way of knowing I would be the one who was going to show up there. No way that ambush was actually intended to go that way. If you ask me, they just saw an opportunity and took it. The doctor hummed in acknowledgement, seemingly only half listening at first, though a moment later she did lift an eyebrow as she processed his words a bit more. So, they were just meant to be a trap to thin out any troops that would be sent to that location? She asked, with a tone that sounded ever so slightly horrified at the idea of such indiscriminate brutality. The wrinkles on her old face grew more pronounced as she furrowed it into a frown. James could only shrug against the thick pillow. I suppose, he agreed at first, though then he too began to ponder a bit. That did seem exceedingly random, even for the kind of people they were talking about here. Inevitably, he thought back to that day. Of course, to his memory, it was almost like it had just happened a couple of minutes ago. They had made themselves out to be some sort of helpless captives, going through great lengths to appear as if they were unconscious. James himself had not been able to tell the difference until literally the moment it was too late. He had to wonder how well they would have been able to keep up appearances, had they decided not to reveal themselves. Judging by the fact that they had taken a flashbang without so much as flinching, he had to assume pretty damn well. Assuming attacking him was a quick decision once they realized who he was, what would have happened had someone else come to find them in that cellar? They would have been found, deemed to be bound and unconscious, likely taken in for treatment and questioning. Since they are humans, they would have most likely been taken into human facilities as well, meaning they would probably have been brought on board of one of the ships. But what then? They would certainly have been under all kinds of supervision, and even if they were dangerous on board of a warship filled with trained soldiers, the damage that they could have done would certainly have been rather minimal. In fact, that line of thinking led right back into the random thinning of people working against them. Just maybe they would have gotten a couple of civilians in this scenario. Still hardly worth it. Surely there was something else they could have wanted to... James's eyes went wide, and he snapped upright so violently that his damaged lungs firmly protested the movement through an attempted secession from the union of his body, apparently trying to leave it through his mouth as he got caught up in a brutal fit of coughing. Immediately his doctor hurried over to him in worry, though she could do little more than stand by just in case, while he coughed himself out. "I thought I told you you needed to give your lungs some rest," she scolded mildly, once James finally managed to wrestle his breathing back under control. "The connections!" he managed to press out in between painful spasms, to the great visible confusion of his doctor. Connections? She wondered, clearly completely lost on what the hell he meant by that. Inhaling deeply against the pain, as if he had just surfaced from a long dive, James forced the irritation of his lungs to take a back seat, as he suppressed the reflex to empty them through sheer force of will. "Call the Admiral," he ordered the doctor, knowing fully well she would have a much easier time being articulate than he would right now. "Tell her the connections that a vessel found, they wanted to plant one of those on the ships." Although it was just a gut feeling that he had, James was entirely convinced of that. Randomly killing a few soldiers or doctors? Absolutely useless. Planning assassins on the off chance that he may be the one to stumble upon them? Idiotic. Imitating people in need, where they knew they would for sure be found by UHSDF soldiers and taken in for treatment? Well, if there was a way to get on board of one of these ships, that was certainly the most feasible one. And if they were possibly able to very effectively hide whatever they were going to use to forge those connections somewhere on, or maybe in their bodies? "The Admiral?" James's doctor asked after a brief moment of seemingly being stunned by his sudden demands. "But I can't—" "If it's my doctor calling, she's going to pick up," James interrupted with an imperious tone, and looked to the older woman with a commanding glare. "Now do it!" "And your show is destroyed?" Admiral Krieger questioned the AI, after she returned with the presumably good news that she had taken care of the presumed remain of Michael. Although the question may have appeared redundant, she was not going to take any chances with this. In fact, out of anything she was never going to take any chances on, this was certainly at the top of that list. Of all things, Michael. "I am certain," Veslon replied, in a tone that was a bit colder than usual. Given her first hesitation, that much was probably to be expected. Still, Krieger couldn't exactly pretend like she liked the tone the real eyes was taking. Not because she felt disrespected or anything, it just made her shudder. "Good," she replied anyway, making damn sure to not let her uncomfortable feelings seep into her voice. "Thank you for the report." "Anything else?" Veslon inquired, in a way that made it very clear that she would rather be left unbothered for a bit, at least when it came to her active attention. The Admiral swallowed inadvertently. "Nothing right now," she confirmed for the realized. "Thank you for your assistance." The call was hung up without any more fanfare, and Krieger couldn't help but let out a breath that she didn't realize she was holding after a few seconds. When she stood up straight and used her hand to comb a few strands of hair out of her face, she noticed a bit of a glimmer in the corner of her vision. Sure enough, when she turned her head, one of the incarcerated assassins was staring at her. The man's summer green eyes were once again focused on her, like the first time she had stepped in front of his cell. However, right now, there was something different about his expression. Before, it had only been intense. There had really been no other word for it, and there hadn't been more to it than that either. But now, it was a bit different. Instead of simply staring into her eyes, he seemed to actually return her gaze. There was actual eye contact happening here, a form of communication that he and his contemporary had so far refused to engage in. And as they looked into hers, his wide eyes glimmered with a sadistic glee. For a moment, Admiral Krieger was taken aback and, admittedly, even a little angry at the man's expression, because she knew exactly what it meant. However, after just a brief moment, she managed to catch herself again. She let out another slow exhale and collected her feelings, balling them up into a perfect sphere. "Saw fear in my eyes, did you?" she assumed aloud, keeping up the eye contact as her finger pressed down onto the panel that would activate the intercom. "I must admit you are attentive." She didn't expect to reply. Of course, without a tongue and with his hands tightly bound, he had very little chance to give an understandable reply in the first place. Still, so far, they had refused to even make attempts at communication, and she expected that trend to continue, even if he had momentarily slipped from his stoicism at the mere hint of a weakness. But to her surprise, he actually reacted. Again, there wasn't a whole lot he could actually do, but he did shift slightly in his seat, as far as his restraints would allow it, at least. And then, he winked a single time with his right eye. Blink once if you can understand me. That's what she had told him before, and although he had blinked a lot since then, it had quite clearly never been deliberate. Just blinking like every human did. But a wink? A wink was something else. A wink wasn't something you just did naturally. And by the way he was staring at her, it was clear he was waiting to see if she caught that. "Finally willing to talk?" she asked into the intercom, giving away that she had in fact caught it. Maybe she was lucky, and he was getting beyond bored in that cell, so much so that he would be willing to, well, probably just insult her. But at least he would be communicating. However, although she could tell from his expression that he was very pleased that she had understood his signal, it seemed like communication was going to end there. She tried a few more times with a couple different prompts, prodding questions, and even attempts at self-deprivation. Sadly, it remained completely useless. Sighing, she took her hand off the intercom. Wordlessly, she picked up the tablet that lay on a small table that had been set up for the people watching the prisoners, at least while she wasn't around. By now, she wasn't getting data on the situation compiled into big reports anymore. Instead, she had arranged it so that anything that was discovered about these people was directly sent to her, no matter how minor. Thus, the list of info was constantly growing, expanding ever so slightly with new discoveries for her to read through every time she picked it up. But this time, she was surprised at just how much had been added since the last time she had checked, just maybe a quarter hour ago. Scrolling all the way up to the point she had last left off, she began to read through it. The more lines she went over, the more her brows furrowed. She couldn't help but occasionally glance over at the two prisoners, as her expression and inner world turned more and more thoughtful. The identities of the surviving assassins have been discovered to be Jeremy Mankey, 29, male, and Kim Flynn, 24, female. Genetic ID was unavailable due to the suspect's association with the CEC branch of the watched group Broken Children, translated. It is assumed that they were born into the group and never had their ID generated. Until recently, their community was settled outside of Atri, a town in the south of the Central European Consolidation. Their community was disbanded after multiple of its leading figures were arrested on multiple charges, including but not limited to child endangerment, sexual assault of minors, aggravated assault, and violation of human dignity. Admiral Krieger needed to clear her throat a bit as she read over those charges. Not that she was unfamiliar with dealing with the scum of the earth in her line of work, but that didn't mean it ever got any less revolting to think about the kinds of people who would sink to such levels. Once again, she glanced over at those green eyes that were staring her down. She couldn't help but wonder just where in the ranks of that presumable pyramid of abuse he had been settled, when that place still existed. After the community's disbanding, most members were either taken in by various humanitarian aid organizations or found a new home in various communities of the same belief group in the surrounding areas. However, the whereabouts of those taking part in the attack on Councilman Aldwin were not discovered until today. Due to the circumstances of their recovery, it is assumed they found sanctuary with a radicalized branch of the Church of the Failed Savior, though no concrete evidence for that assumption could be obtained yet. Broken children taken in by the Failed Savior? That was certainly unusual. The belief system of the Failed Savior could in theory be applied to all kinds of walks of life, of course, with the entire idea being that there was no right or wrong way to find your connection to God. But, based on her very limited knowledge of the broken children, Admiral Krieger understood that they were very much more strict in what they were and weren't allowed to believe, or do, for that matter. Her interactions with the cult had been sparse, but she quite vividly remembered a time when she had been ceremoniously presented with a fresh batch of recently graduated privates who were boarding one of the ships under her command. Among them was an extremely motivated and disciplined young woman who had shown great promise in her physical and disciplinary training, but very much struggled in the more interpersonal aspects of being part of an army. One of the reasons for which the Admiral got to experience firsthand when, in a quiet moment, the private had basically begged her to speak to her in person for a moment. A conversation that had certainly turned interesting the more it had gone on, with the girl revealing some curious quirks about her upbringing in that very group. Things she decided not to dwell on out of respect for that bright young lady, who had hopefully recovered from that abusive lifestyle now that she had thankfully been rescued out of that world. Either way, she certainly remembered how very restrictive she could tell that group was, just based on the vibe she got from that one conversation alone. To think someone like that would join up with the failed savior was strange. However, at least it did somewhat explain these cybernetic alterations in people who were supposedly members of a group so very staunchly opposed to those kinds of modifications. The Broken Children were a group that could in many ways be called transhumanist. If these assassins had really been former members, they would certainly be far more willing to undergo such a procedure than most other people would be. Once she had read over some less immediately eye-catching info, Krieger couldn't help but move back to the intercom, her eyes affixed to the man sitting in the cell. It seemed like he saw something in her gaze, because one of his eyebrows lifted slightly in a clear sign of anticipation. "Jeremy," she said, pressing down the button. She wasn't sure if it was deliberate communication or a simple reflexive reaction upon hearing his name, but the man's eyes widened as the syllables left her lips. It looked like the identification was right then. Exhaling slowly, the Admiral then decided to make use of what little she had learned about the man's former cult through the conversation with that private. "James forgives you," she lied. Well, truth be told, she wasn't sure if it was a lie. Since it was only himself who had gotten hurt, there was a good chance her poor, naive son actually held no ill will towards these assassins for all she knew. Still, right now, it was only important to say these things, not if they were true or not. "As do I." Of course, just because she knew the right words to say, that didn't necessarily mean that it was going to reach the man in any way. And she was fully ready to have him just blow it off and return to whatever he was doing. However, despite the lack of confidence on her part, it turned out that what she said actually had a far greater impact than she would have anticipated even in a best-case scenario. While looking into his eyes, she got to witness the moment when they began to water. The glimmer in his eyes slowly grew more and more pronounced until finally, thick tears began to flow down along his cheeks, leaving the Admiral honestly taken aback for a moment. "There!" The sergeant's muffled voice came out, in a suppressed echo from somewhere inside the wall that, right now, only his feet were sticking out of. "Got the damn bugger!" After he gave the sign of slamming the tip of his boot down onto the floor twice, the soldiers accompanying him quickly grabbed him by his ankles and pulled him out of the opened hole in the wall, which luckily was made quite a bit easier through the station's lowered gravity. Soon enough his legs emerged, followed by his body, then his head of dark hair, and finally his extended arms that clenched a quietly beeping sensor in one hand and an unassuming little device that looked like a small rectangular box with no identifying features, but two now cut cables sticking out of one end of it in the other. Once he was fully pulled out, he pushed himself into a sitting position, crossing his legs as he leaned forward and brought both items together. The closer he brought the sensor to the other item, the more intense the beeping indicated that it was detecting exactly what it had been fine-tuned to. "No shot we would have found it without knowing what to look for," he mused, as he pulled the two things apart again so the beeping wouldn't start getting on everyone's nerves. "Regular old cable spaghetti in there." "What do you think that is, Sarge?" one of the privates accompanying him asked, crouching down to take a better look at the thing he had removed from the wall. Her blue eyes fixated on it for a moment, and her brows furrowed as she seemingly racked her brain. However, the answer to that was probably a bit more disappointing than she imagined. "My best guess? Literally the connection part of a phone, computer or assistant or something, disassembled and shoved into a plastic hull to keep it together," was what he assumed, explaining as much aloud as he weighed the black box in his hand. Just something that connected the closed system to the larger net, or at least to the other systems around here that are already connected to it. The private's eyes widened a bit as she stood up straighter and looked around. "But this is gravity control," she more exhaled than said, as she glanced around at the massive control center they had more or less forced their way into with the excuse of imminent danger. "Shouldn't there be preventative measures against that sort of thing?" All around, the various core worlder workers who ran this place were staring at the invading Deathworlders more than suspiciously, especially as they apparently started to disassemble the walls. Though nobody directly said anything about it, the sergeant could only imagine that the trust in humans around this very specific kind of control room was still just a little bit damaged after the actions of a certain former ambassador of theirs. "Which is why we needed to go get that thing out ASAP, he confirmed, before finally getting up to his feet, untangling his legs beneath him in the process. "Whoever installed it probably has some form of access code," he assumed, while clenching the discovered device in his hand, allowing his gaze to sweep over the staring office workers, who were so very displeased about their presence so far. "Hopefully this will be enough to convince them to run a thorough security sweep of their systems." He turned to his second-in-command. "Corporal, we have orders to inform the Admiral directly about our discoveries. Call this device in while I try to wrangle the locals," he ordered. "And remember to go through the realized." "Yes, sir," the corporal replied, and immediately got on the radio to follow the command. The sergeant waited a moment, just to hear the first words of the exchange, before he would get on with his own task. "Hello, Avezalon. This is Corporal Mosley. Could you please connect me to the Admiral with confirmation that I'm legit?" he requested, after a very brief wait, indicating that everything was proceeding as planned. Satisfied with that, the sergeant began to walk off in the direction of who looked like they had probably had some position of power around here, at least based on their presence alone. However, he had barely made it a few steps when his ears picked up on something that caused him to halt. "What do you mean?" Corporal Mosley asked, his tone firm but clearly slightly concerned. Then, a few moments later, he seemingly followed up on whatever answer he had gotten to his question with, "And you're certain she's not just busy and not picking up?" Meanwhile, Moses' face turned even darker, especially as he listened to whatever the AI was telling him now, in return to that second question. The sergeant turned on his heels and marched towards him with firm steps. "Corporal, report," he demanded, really unhappy about only having half of this seemingly not at all reassuring conversation. Corporal Mosley visibly swallowed as he snapped up to stand at attention. "Avezalon reports that she cannot make a connection to the Admiral, sir." He quickly related what was going on. Based on the question he had heard the corporal ask earlier, the sergeant knew he didn't need to waste time with the same inquiries. Clearly there was more going on than just not getting picked up. "Make contact with Vice Admiral Kazadi. Inform him about the device and about the inability to contact the Admiral," he ordered. And although it certainly sounded like he was talking to his corporal, he knew that the realized would be far quicker in getting it done, assuming she was actually about to cooperate. "Yes, sir," the corporal replied anyway, and resumed his conversation with the realized. Meanwhile, the sergeant bit the inside of his cheek. This was most likely very bad. However, it also showed that there was even more urgency in making sure this system was secure now, and so he quickly returned to his earlier task, his steps showing even more intensity now, as he approached who he assumed was in charge here. "This is unacceptable!" Representative Kumar exclaimed loudly, bringing his hands down onto the table in a moment of unrestrained rage that was admittedly not very befitting of his position. If he was being honest, the body representative of the trio Kakumina probably didn't look all that dignified right now, dressed in his best worn PJs and with bed hair to match. But quite frankly, he didn't care about that one bit as he glared bloody murder at the communal colleague he was connected to via video call at the moment. After he had been ripped from a comparatively peaceful slumber by his very loud and violent, important, urgent news alarm, and subsequently read the message that not only he, but every single inhabitant of Earth, his territories, and most likely the surrounding ones as well, had gotten, it had taken him all of 2 minutes to get up, jump in front of his terminal and demand an immediate explanation as to what was the meaning of this. Dear citizens of the 84th to 120th degree of the Orion Arm. The message sent to man and mouse within the mentioned part of the galaxy had read, sadly, we have to inform you about a spontaneous yet necessary maintenance of the fusion satellite N degree 0765, which has been reported as damaged. To allow for maintenance, the fusion satellite will need to be deactivated, which will cut off your access to galactic networks for a couple of hours, beginning with today's 6th hour. The exact duration of the maintenance is unknown. However, you can be assured that our specialists will do their best to fix the issue as quickly as possible, and restore your net access as soon as at all feasible. We apologize for the inconvenience. Thank you for your understanding. Best regards, the Galactic Communal Network Agency. Obviously, understanding was the last word Representative Kumar would use to describe his own reaction to the information provided. The representative of the agency he had been patched through to, who appeared to be a rather young adult sipper's lane by the look of them, wiggled their trunk hesitantly as they tried their best to stay calm in the face of the politician's outburst. "I'm sorry, sir," they finally brought out, after apparently realizing that they couldn't stall any longer, and their nervous tone indicated that they were about ready to press coal into diamonds between their cheeks. "To assure a flawless function of the galactic network, a damaged fusion satellite has to be repaired immediately." "Where does the information that the satellite is damaged come from?" Kumar demanded, without letting the worker finish. "We have noticed no inconsistencies in our connections. We have also not heard anything of the like from our Paracene or Tenastrosite contacts." His fingers made a squeaky sound as they dragged over the table's surface, slowly balling into tight fists. The Sipperslang flinched quite heavily at the harsh interruption, and the wiggling of their trunk got much faster. Their fur began to stand up a bit as they sank into themselves, apparently doing their best to not look directly into his eyes. "There were various calls about the damage, and a report of our engineers has confirmed," they started to explain, half loud, but Kumar once again didn't have the patience for their mumbling. "I want to see that report. I want a detailed explanation of the damage, including pictures and the exact repairs that need to be made, and the effects that it will have if they remain unrepaired for a little longer," he firmly ordered, pushing himself up a little taller with his fists, while he stared his fellow Deathworlder down. The Sipperslang seemed to be caught in a fight-or-flight reaction, as their entire trunk momentarily disappeared into their mouth while they completely froze up. Blinking heavily, they luckily shook the shock off a few seconds later, spitting out their trunk again, as they quickly stuttered, "Sir, that's not... you can't," they tried to protest. However, their words cut off when Kumar clenched his fist so tightly that his knuckles released loud cracks under the tension. "I don't think you understand what I am saying," he then said, slowly lifting his arms to cross them in front of his chest, while he spoke in no uncertain terms. "The last time our fusion satellite was spontaneously maintained, it was to cover up that our ambassador was kidnapped. Therefore, I am not making a request as your customer. As the current liaison of the UHSDF elected by the Human Council of Governance, I demand that the report be sent to us as a full explanation, and I will send our military ships to the fusion satellite with express orders to not let anybody touch it until that report is cleared by our own experts. Do I make myself clear?" The Sipperslang's entire body was shivering as they processed the threat. Kumar wasn't sure if they had quite realized who exactly they were talking to so far, but at least it seemed like they were taking him more than seriously. They stammered, at an utter loss for words, and it almost seemed like they were getting close to a full-blown panic attack. Kumar sighed and let out a sharp, slightly exalted exhale. There was probably not much to gain by yelling at what may have been an intern or something. "Just patch me through to your boss," he said, in a tone that was still firm but much calmer now, hoping that a more diplomatic approach would get much faster results here. However, his threat was far from empty, and while he was physically still speaking to the customer service, he already reached for his phone in order to get the necessary orders out there. No one was going to touch that damn satellite on his watch. "I suppose the cars will fall as they might," Brother Abbott commented, standing up from behind the mechanical monstrosity he had slaved away in front of for so many months now. It almost seemed like he was a bit unsteady on his feet, though that was likely just from this single session. He had, after all, not been completely confined to this room during that time, even if it seemed like it sometimes. Let's hope the redundancies really were as redundant as we assume they are. Alexander nodded, rubbing his hands together to try and keep them warm. Has it really destroyed it? He asked, glancing around at the broken, half-molten circuits, which supposedly had more power behind them than any mere mortal could imagine. And yet, apparently, it had all still been wiped out, almost in an instant. Gone. Reduced to photons, Abbott confirmed. His voice wasn't exactly saddened by the loss, but Alexander could tell that he was certainly a bit disappointed. Still, this was the expected outcome, and he had been ready for it. Still, I was able to put everything we planned into motion before I lost access. Alexander grimaced slightly. And you're sure that will be enough, considering how easily it got rid of your marvel? He questioned. He knew that Abbott understood these things far better than he did. Still, if it was that easy for the Realized to wipe out the entire thing, would whatever it spawned really be able to keep that thing at bay? However, Brother Abbott just shook his head, slowly. Guy Page, you may swat a mosquito with a single strike, but the sickness it carries will still lay you out for weeks on end, he replied, in a simple metaphor that actually made things quite understandable to the guide. For our purposes, it will be enough. Alexander nodded, satisfied. Quite apt, he complimented. Let's hope the comparison is as fitting as it sounds. With a gesture of his hand, he opened the door to the freezer. Rubbing his hands again, he couldn't wait to get out of this cursed cold, as he nodded for Abbott to follow him. However, as they both moved towards the threshold and were just about to cross it, Alexander suddenly flinched quite heavily, as a loud sound came from all around them, and his hand instinctively reached for the pendant around his neck, as the enormous door suddenly fell shut with a loud bang right in front of them, moving far quicker and louder than it usually did. Lord! Alexander exclaimed in mild shock, feeling the ground shake under his feet, while Abbott tilted his head and inspected the door with some curiosity. I suppose my presence made people slacken the maintenance, the brother then assumed, in an amused tone. With a gesture of his hand, the door soon opened again, and Abbott walked right on through without hesitation. Alexander paused for a moment, half afraid that the thing was going to come down on him the moment he took another step forward. However, as nothing happened for a good few seconds, he ultimately decided to move quickly, dashing over the threshold with a few swift steps, and slowing down again on the other side. We better mention that to the facility manager, he mused, and gestured for the door to close again, which it did in its usual slow and comparatively quiet manner, sealing shut just as it had always done, and leaving the empty marvel as a memory behind them, as they got ready to depart.